Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I did not move to Southeast Alaska to become the last person in the trees. That part just happened. Before all of this, my life was simple, in a way that felt almost boring. I was 34, a seasonal ranger assistant and maintenance tech who spent my summers in the Tongass National Forest and my winters taking whatever repair jobs I could find. I fixed generators at remote cabins, cleared trails, checked campsites, changed filters in small water plants, and occasionally gave talks to tourists about not feeding black bears. The treehouse started as a long project, nothing more. I called it the Canopy Redoubt as a joke one night on the radio when a friend asked how my weird forest balcony was going. It was a refuge for me long before it became a literal one, a platform built between four tall Sitka spruce trees, about 35 feet above the forest floor. I wanted a place where I could sleep above the bugs, watch the weather roll in, and listen to the forest without engines and human sounds. Over 2 summers, I turned that idea into a structure that even I had to admit was more than a hobby. 4 big spruce trees formed the corners of the main platform. I used steel brackets and 6 tension cables anchored into the trunks. The deck itself was about 20 by 20 feet, framed in pressure-treated lumber, with plywood sheathing and a simple rail. A compact sleeping loft hung under the highest spruce. I installed a lockable trapdoor with a counterweight so it closed quietly, a small workbench with a vise and storage, and a corner where a little backpacking stove sat on a metal plate screwed onto the plywood. 2 sleeping options were strapped along one wall, a 2-person hammock and an old emergency cot. I lined the inside with heavy-duty tarps, stapled and battened down, then added thin plywood panels over them to break the wind. When you stepped inside and dropped the trapdoor, the outside world fell away. You could still hear the forest, but it became a muted background instead of a constant roar of rain and wind. I also wired in power. 400 watts of solar panels were bolted to a small frame on the sunniest side of the trees, angled south. Wiring ran through flexible conduit to a lithium iron phosphate battery bank stored in a weatherproof box on a side platform. That battery bank fed a small distribution panel with fuses and switches. From there, I ran lines to LED lanterns, task lights at the workbench, and charging ports. A marine VHF radio sat near the window on a shelf, alongside a handheld ham receiver. Both were wired into the power system, with backup battery packs stored nearby. A gutter system hung along the edge of the rooftop, feeding into a 50-gallon food-grade barrel. From there, a gravity hose ran through a ceramic filter down to a jerry can dispenser. I tested it during rainstorms, measuring flow, back-flushing filters, writing down notes like I was preparing for a small field study instead of just trying to avoid hauling water from a stream. Food stayed in bear-resistant storage bins that I hoisted up with a block and tackle. I kept about a month of canned goods, dehydrated meals, oatmeal, rice, and peanut butter up there, plus spare gas canisters for the stove. Fishing gear hung near the trapdoor, collapsible rod, tackle box, waders, and a net. As a ranger assistant, I knew the streams nearby. I knew where salmon moved and where trout lingered in deeper pools. I also took defense seriously, even before the world changed. The forest had bears, the occasional illegal grower, and people who did not like rules. So the access system was built with security in mind. The only normal way up was a manual winch-operated lift platform made from a small square frame and slats, guided by 2 vertical rails attached to one of the spruces. When it reached the top, I locked it in place with a mechanical brake and pinned safety latches. There was also a retractable rope ladder rolled up on a pulley, used only in emergencies. A detachable rope bridge ran from the main platform to a secondary spruce with a small observation deck but I usually kept it pulled in so there was no easy path between trees. Around the base of the trees, I tied passive noise alarms, metal cans filled with a few rocks, hanging off paracord lines that crossed likely paths. I made strips of dry bark wired to branches so anything brushing past them would make sound. There was a trail camera pointing at the old game path nearby, not because I expected trouble, but because monitoring was a habit. In terms of real weapons, I owned a pump-action 12-gauge shotgun with a short, practical barrel and a worn, synthetic stock. It was more a bare and emergency defense tool than anything else, and I only kept 25 shells up there, mostly buckshot and a few slugs. I also had a .357 Magnum revolver locked in a metal box with 2 speed loaders, plus a wood axe, splitting maul, a sharpened steel gaff, and a 3-foot pry bar. Most of those tools were for work, not for combat, but they would serve either purpose. That was my world, a strange but stable setup in the trees above one small part of the Tongass. The outbreak began on a clear morning. I woke to the usual sound of rain on the tarp roof, then realized it was not rain this time, but a light breeze pushing through wet branches. I checked the time on my watch. It was a little after 6. The marine VHF on the shelf was static, a soft hiss that had become background noise, but then a fragment of voice cut through it. Coast Guard Sector Juno, be advised, we have multiple reports of... Static swallowed the rest. I turned the volume up, the way you do when something feels wrong, even before your brain catches up. Another voice came through, more distant, the signal bouncing off something. Unusual aggressive incidents near harbour facilities. Individuals unresponsive to pain. Repeat, unresponsive. I had heard plenty of alerts before. Collisions, groundings, drunk boaters, people firing reckless flares. This sounded different, but I could still slot it into the usual mental category of human trouble. I will not see this far inland. I am not proud of how easily I did that. I brewed coffee on the stove, watching the steam rise, listening to more words drift through the static. Advised to remain indoors, multiple unprovoked attacks. Another channel crackled to life a little after 9, Ranger dispatch. Station 3, respond with status. The reply was shaky. You can hear stress even over the radio. Station 3 here. We've had to secure the gate. People came in from town. We had to lock everything down. I repeat, we are sheltering in place. Copy that. All stations, stay in your facilities. Do not respond to calls from town unless authorized. I stared at the radio, mug halfway to my mouth. This was not a normal advisory. We rarely locked visitors out. We rarely refused to respond. By early afternoon, the channels were full. Coast Guard, local sheriff, state emergency management. Words repeated enough to sink in. Extreme aggression, containment failure, do not approach bodies, shelter in place, avoid exposure to blood or bodily fluids. I remember slowly setting down the mug and looking around the inside of the treehouse with fresh eyes. Plywood, tarps, cables, hand tools, a radio shelf. The place had always been a fun engineering project. Now every detail looked like a checklist item on an improvised safety plan. Around 4 in the afternoon, a final transmission from one of the closer ranger stations came through. This is Station 2. We're seeing people on the access road. They're on foot. They are... The voice paused. They're not responding. They're approaching the vehicles. We are locking the doors. We need support. The reply came from dispatch. Negative. Station 2. No units available. Shelter in place. There was a loud crash in the background and someone shouting. The radio clicked off and never came back. By evening, most channels had fallen silent or turned into overlapping, distorted audio that made no sense. I heard something about a national emergency, something about restricted airspace, and something about hospitals being overloaded. Then, a long burst of static on the Coast Guard channel, and nothing after it. When the last clear transmission cut out mid-sentence, I climbed up to the observation point at the edge of the main platform and looked down through the branches. I did not go down to base camp that night. I did not walk the trails or check the creek. It was not fear at that point, or at least I told myself that. It was caution. I decided I would stay in the treehouse overnight, monitor the situation on the radio, and go down the next day if things calmed down. They did not calm down. The next morning, the forest was quiet in an unnatural way. You learn the normal sound patterns over time. Squirrels, birds, wind, occasional distant engine noise from boats in the channel or seaplanes overhead. This morning, the air was still. No small animal chatter, no distant engines. I opened the trapdoor, lowered the lift platform, and rode it halfway down, stopping in the shadow of the trees. I listened again. Nothing. The sense of wrongness became physical. I eased the platform the rest of the way, stepped off, and moved carefully along the game path. This part of the forest had muskeg pockets, patches of wet ground dotted with low shrubs and open spaces between stands of spruce and hemlock. The air smelled of damp soil and needles. Visibility was decent in some directions where the trees spread just enough to let the light in. I saw them when I stepped around a thicket. 3 people standing maybe 50 yards away in a shallow open area. Their clothes were wet and dirty, like they had fallen repeatedly. One man still wore a bright tourist jacket I recognized from a trailhead a few days before. The other 2 were dressed in work gear, rubber boots, and stained jackets. One was a fisherman. I had once pulled out of a ditch when his truck slid off a logging road. He had laughed about it at the time and offered me coffee. Now he was silent. They stood too still at first, their heads tilted slightly. Then one of them started to move. The motion was slow and jerky, weight shifting unevenly, as if his joints were not responding properly. The tourist woman turned, stumbling, feet dragging through the moss. Her hands hung loosely at her sides. Her skin looked pale and wrong, even from a distance. I called out without thinking, "Hey, you need help?" None of them responded. The fisherman's head moved in my direction, but his eyes did not seem to focus. There was no recognition, just a slow pivot toward the sound. He took several unsteady steps, then his ankle rolled on a hummock. He fell hard into the wet ground. The impact made a dull sound you would expect to knock the wind out of someone. He did not react. He lay face down for a long moment, then pushed himself up again with stiff, slow movements. He rose to his feet, with a jerking motion that did not match normal human effort. My mind tried to fit what I was seeing into familiar categories. Injury, shock, intoxication, hypothermia. None of them matched. The radio phrases floated back in. Unresponsive to pain. Do not approach bodies. My legs wanted to move. Instead, I stayed still and watched them shuffle across the muskeg, turning irregularly, looking around without purpose. They did not speak. They did not call for help. They did not act like people at all. The tourist woman's jacket was torn at the shoulder. The skin beneath was discolored and broken. I could not see details from that distance, and I did not want to. My brain did not need more evidence. They were dead, or as close to it as made no difference. Their bodies still moved, but whatever made them human was gone. I backed away, step by slow step, making sure not to snap any branches under my boots. Once I had a line of trees between us, I turned and moved faster, staying low, scanning constantly. When I reached the narrow path up to the base of my trees, I felt something I rarely felt in the forest. I felt exposed. I hauled myself up onto the lift platform, pulled the control rope, and cranked the winch handle with more speed than finesse. The platform glided upward along its rails. I locked the mechanical brake, swung the trapdoor open, and climbed inside, pulling the door shut behind me and securing the latch. My elevated retreat was no longer just a project. It was a barrier between me and whatever was happening down there. I sat on the edge of the cot, heart pounding, and forced myself through a checklist. Power, water, food, access, tools. I checked everything twice with my hands, not trusting my memory. The solar panels were still in place. The battery bank showed a solid charge. The rain barrel at the corner was more than half full, and the ceramic filter still dripped slowly into the jerry can. The bear bins were stocked with canned goods, dried meals, rice, oats, and peanut butter. The ammunition box under the bench held the shotgun shells and revolver rounds. The passive alarms below were out of sight, but still connected to the little tension lines tied to a hook near the trapdoor. If something moved them, the line would twitch. I took the Marine VHF off its bracket and turned the volume up again. The channels were mostly static now. Occasionally, I heard fragments of distant chatter, frantic and fragmented, with words like quarantine, cordon, fall back, but nothing coherent. No more ranger calls, no more status reports. For the first time, the treehouse felt small. The first day after that, I stayed inside almost entirely. I allowed myself a few minutes at the observation gap near the roof, watching through branches toward the muskeg. I saw movement several times. The three figures from the morning passed through my field of view again at one point, shifting direction with no clear reason, almost colliding, then separating. Sometimes they stood still for minutes at a time, swaying slightly, then suddenly moved again. Later, more of them appeared. Some in work clothes, some in tourist gear, at least one in a uniform that might have been law enforcement from the distant town. All moved with the same wrong gait, slow and jerky, but relentless, never fully stopping, never showing signs of fatigue. By the second day, the forest began to fill with low sounds, not the calls of birds or the chatter of squirrels, but something heavier, labored breathing, occasional low vocalizations that did not form words. The sounds carried in strange ways through the trees, making it hard to tell how many there were or where exactly they stood. I began to reinforce the treehouse. I tightened every bolt I could reach. I added additional supports under the sleeping loft with metal brackets. I checked the tension cables and added backup straps in case any original hardware failed. I stuffed strips of fabric along boards that creaked when stepped on, and adjusted the hinges on the trapdoor to close more softly. I wrapped pieces of old rubber around sections of the winch handle and motor so they would not squeak when I operated it slowly. Noise discipline became an obsession. I moved quietly, set tools down gently, and avoided dropping anything. I ate cold meals when I did not want to risk the small noise of the stove ignition. Every small sound echoed down in my imagination, turning into bait for whatever paced the forest below. By the end of that first week, the forest floor under my trees was rarely empty. Sometimes, one or two of them would stand directly below the platform, looking up in a vague way that made my skin crawl. Other times, groups of 5 or 6 wandered through the area, brushing past the trunks, shuffling over roots, stumbling through undergrowth. They did not climb. They would place hands on the bark and push or slide, but their fingers did not grip with enough strength or coordination to ascend. I tested their range of senses from the safety of my height. When I dropped a small piece of bark by accident one afternoon, 3 nearby heads snapped in the direction of the sound, and they converged on that spot. They sniffed the air, then wandered around that area for a long time before moving on. When I spoke a low word once without thinking, one of them paused and turned in my general direction, but did nothing else. They did not seem to see me when I stayed behind the rails and branches. They reacted strongly to sound and possibly scent, but not much to shapes high above. I tried to treat it as data. I did not let myself assign extra meaning. I needed to understand them if I wanted to survive above them. My supplies became numbers. The barrel contained a certain volume of water. My daily requirement for drinking, cooking, and minimal washing was another. I divided, estimated, and marked tallies on the side of the water container with a waterproof pen. The food bins became a table in my notebook. Each day, I wrote what I ate and how many meals remained at that pace. Water was the easiest problem for the moment. The Tongass is wet. It rained several times during that week, filling the barrel and overflowing through the relief hose. As long as I could keep the gutters clear and the filter unclogged, I would not die of thirst. Food was harder. A month's supply sounds like a lot until you start counting days with no idea when you can safely supplement it. I forced myself down to 2 small meals a day and 1 cup of coffee instead of 2. When my stomach complained, I made tea from pine needles or just drank extra water. After 3 days, the hunger became a steady, dull pressure that I could ignore. I decided to supplement with small game as soon as I could. That meant leaving the treehouse. On the 4th morning, when fog rolled through the trees, dampening sound and limiting visibility, I made a decision. I strapped on my boots, checked my revolver, slung the shotgun in a simple carry harness I had built from webbing, and lowered the lift platform slowly. The noise alarms did not move. I stepped off at the base, scanned in every direction and listened. There were shapes in the fog, but they moved like branches in wind, not like walking bodies. I moved along a side path, staying close to the trunks, shotgun held in both hands, in a low, ready position. I had no intention of firing if I could avoid it. The report would echo through the forest and bring more of them. The gun was a last resort. My goal was a rocky ledge near a small clearing about 200 yards away. I had set snares there occasionally for rabbits and seen grouse tracks once. There was also a narrow vantage point where I could see a longer distance without committing to an open area. I advanced in short bursts, pausing behind trees, watching for motion. Twice I saw one of them through gaps in the fog, moving slowly across my path, but far enough away that I could wait for them to pass. They did not look up. They did not sniff the air with purpose. They just moved. When I reached the ledge, I found one of my old snare spots and reset it with fresh cord from my pocket kit. I stayed long enough to scan the area beyond. In the far distance, through a break in the trees, I thought I saw smoke. Not a straight plume like a chimney, but a broad haze as if something larger was burning. I could not be sure. I went back the way I had come, climbing onto the lift platform with a relief that made my hands shake a little. When the trapdoor closed above me and the latch slid shut, the treehouse felt different again. It was no longer just a barrier. It was a position that I could leave and return to as long as I was careful. On the 7th day after the first sighting, things changed again. It was late afternoon. I was on the secondary platform attached to one of the other spruces, checking the tension on a cable, when I heard the first unusual sound. It was a low scraping, steady and rhythmic. Not branches, not wind. Something dragged along bark. I moved to the edge and looked down. On the ground directly below the main tree stood a woman. She wore jeans, a jacket, and boots caked with mud. Her hair hung forward in tangled strands. Her skin had the same pale, unhealthy tone as the others. Her eyes, from that distance, were dark and flat. Her hand was on the trunk. She dragged her knuckles along the bark slowly, in a straight line up and down. The sound was precise, not random. She walked a half circle around the tree, repeating the motion. Every few steps she looked up, not right at me but toward the general area of the platform. Most of the infected moved like wind-up toys. They bumped into obstacles, changed direction without reason, stood still for long periods. This one acted differently. Her pacing had a pattern. She stayed there for a long time. When other infected passed through the area, she stepped aside, then resumed her circuit. When the light began to fade, she finally wandered off into the trees. That night, as I lay in the hammock, I listened for any repeat of that dragging sound. I heard general movement in the forest, occasional low vocalizations from further away, but nothing directly under the treehouse. I still did not sleep well. The next night, she was back. I saw her from the observation gap just after dark, standing in almost the same spot. She made the same slow circle around the base, hand dragging along the bark, head tilting up occasionally. She remained there for hours, shifting from one tree to the next, always returning to the main trunk. Her behavior forced me to alter my routines. I stopped sleeping directly over the main trunk and moved to the secondary platform on the opposite side, rigging a temporary sleeping pad there. I used the smallest possible lights at night and avoided moving near the edges. I set up a set of low-draw infrared sensors pointing downward, connected to a quiet buzzer near my head. If she began to climb in any way, I wanted to know before she reached any height. Days passed. The infected population below the trees increased and then seemed to stabilize. There were always at least 3 or 4 visible in any direction, sometimes more. They drifted through the area, occasionally gathering for no apparent reason, then dispersing. The woman with the dragging hand became a regular presence. Sometimes I would not see her for one night, then she would reappear, pacing her path with that strange deliberateness. I gave her a name in my head because it made it easier to reference her in my notes. I called her the Sentinel. The notes themselves grew in number. I documented movement patterns, rough group sizes, times of day they seemed more active. I marked down any attempts at climbing. There were a few. One infected man managed to get both arms around a smaller spruce and haul himself up about 3 feet before losing grip and falling. Another tried to pull itself over a low stump and slid off repeatedly. None reached any height that threatened the platforms. The Sentinel never tried. She only paced and watched. While I monitored them, the rest of the world continued to collapse out of sight. Radio traffic thinned to near nothing. Once every day or so, I would catch a distant voice, always in distress, often cut off by static. I heard words like evacuation by water, airlift, do not go to the hospital, and repeat, all shelter orders remain in effect. None of it helped me. I was deep in the forest, miles from any road that would be safe for travel. The Tongass is massive. Old-growth trees, muskeg, mountains, islands, and waterways. It felt like I was seeing only a tiny patch of a giant system now cut off from any leadership. Then nature decided to add another problem. It started with distant thunder. Not unusual, but the pattern was wrong. Short, sharp booms close together, then silence, then another cluster. By late afternoon, the sky to the west grew darker, not just from clouds, but from something thicker. The wind picked up and shifted directions in a way that did not match normal storm fronts. I went out onto the observation platform and looked toward the horizon. There was a wide band of smoke rising from somewhere beyond the nearest ridge. Not a thin chimney plume, but a broad, diffuse mass that spread across the lower atmosphere. The smell arrived a few minutes later, that dry, acrid scent of burning wood. Not a campfire, something larger. A lightning storm in a forest this dense was never a small thing, even in normal times. But before, there had been aircraft, crews, communication, and plans. Now there was only wind and whatever small efforts individuals could manage. In the distance, as evening fell, I saw faint orange flickers through the haze. The fire was somewhere beyond immediate sight, but close enough to cause worry. Wind would determine everything. I spent that night half listening to the radio and half staring at the smoke outside. A few frequencies carried chatter about wildfires, evacuations, and impassable roads. One message from a distant station mentioned losing control of a fire line and abandoning equipment on a logging road. The tone was flat and defeated. The next morning, the smoke had thickened. It hung low between the trees, dimming the light. Ash drifted occasionally, small and grey, settling on railings and tarps. The air tasted dry in a way that did not belong in such a wet forest. More animals began to move through the area in odd patterns. A pair of deer trotted past under the trees, not in their usual silent, cautious way, but in a straight, fast line. A black bear moved through at a distance, nose up, heading away from the direction of the smoke. The infected moved too, more than usual, turning and walking in new directions. By midday, the glow on the horizon had grown. The fire was advancing. The treehouse had always been a good defense against things that moved on the ground. It was less appealing as a place to be when a crown fire might sweep through the canopy. I began to plan a retreat. The logical escape route was the nearby river. It ran through a shallow valley about a mile from my current position, eventually feeding toward larger waterways, and out to channels where boats might still be moving. I had a compact inflatable raft stored under the platform in a sealed bag. Originally bought for casual use and emergency crossings, it was not ideal for long travel in rough water, but better than nothing. The challenge was getting from the treehouse to the river, while the forest filled with smoke, infected, and fleeing wildlife. I laid out my gear on the floor inside: backpack, water containers, basic first aid, compact repair kit, extra clothing layers, the revolver with spare rounds, a small selection of shotgun shells, headlamp, spare batteries, knife, fire starter, even though fire was the last thing the forest needed, and enough dried food for at least a week. I added fishing gear and a small net. I rolled up a lightweight tarp and strapped it to the outside. Everything had to be carried on my back or in my hands. I did not want to be overloaded, but I did not want to leave behind something that could mean the difference between surviving a river accident and not. That night, the sentinel spent a long time under the trees. She paced in a wider circle than usual, moving between trunks as if checking each one. At one point, she stopped directly below my observation gap and looked up. Her head tilted in a way I'd not seen before, neck bending more than seemed natural. Her eyes scanned across the boards, pausing approximately where I stood. I stayed perfectly still. The infrared sensors by the trapdoor stayed quiet. She did not attempt to climb. After a long minute, she turned and walked away. I slept in fits, waking every hour to check the glow of the distant fire and listen for new sounds. Once or twice, I heard branches cracking in a way that made my stomach tighten, but nothing fell near the platform. By dawn, the smoke had thickened further, and the light that filtered through it had a dull yellow tone. I decided that waiting any longer would be more dangerous than moving. Evacuation from a position you have spent years building is a strange thing. Every item has history. Every joint and cable has a memory attached. I walked the perimeter one last time, checking bolts I knew were secure, tightening straps that did not need it, running my fingers along the cable that had seemed so indestructible when I installed it. I opened the ammunition box and made a deliberate choice. 12 shells for the shotgun, 1 loaded, 11 inside saddles and pockets. The rest stayed in the box. I did not want to be tempted into using sound unnecessarily. The revolver got 2 full loads, 1 in the cylinder, 1 in a speed loader in my pocket. The raft bag went into a net under the backpack, strapped tight. I filled both water containers from the barrel and topped off a 3rd small bottle to drink on the way. Food went into the pack in order of importance and density. Anything bulky and non-essential stayed behind. When there was nothing left to do, I stood in the middle of the platform and took one last slow look around. The plywood, tarps, cables, small repairs, and scuffs from boots and tools. The radio shelf with its worn knobs, the little notes taped near the switch panel, reminders about battery levels and filter cleaning dates. This kept you alive, I told myself out loud. Saying it made leaving feel like a conscious trade, not a panic reaction. The treehouse had done its job. Now it would stand or fall without me. I lowered the lift platform partway, paused to listen, then continued to the ground as slowly as I could. The noise alarms remained still. The air at ground level smelled worse than above, thicker with smoke and something else, stagnant water, decay, and the faint human scent that clung to the infected. I stepped off the platform with the shotgun in my hands and the pack settling against my shoulders. The forest felt different. Shadows moved strangely in the haze. The usual colour of the undergrowth was muted. I moved in a crouch, feet placing carefully on moss and stable rocks, avoiding loose twigs. Every few steps I stopped to listen, counting breaths and cataloguing sounds. A branch creaked somewhere behind me. There was a soft splash off to the right, possibly in a puddle, then the unmistakable drag of a foot through wet ground. I froze behind a tree and glanced around its trunk. 2 infected moved through the fog ahead, off to my left, heading roughly perpendicular to my intended route. They did not look up. Their arms hung loosely. One of them had an arm that swung too far, possibly broken and reset in some wrong position by whatever force now animated them. I waited until they passed, and then cut across behind them, using their slow speed and narrow focus against them. It felt strange to plan around them like moving obstacles, but that was what they had become. As I got further from the familiar area around Treehouse, the density of infected changed. There were more of them. Some stood still, heads drooped, as if waiting for a cue. Others moved in short, circular routes, stepping around the same trees repeatedly. The noise of the fire grew louder as I approached the valley. The crackle of burning brush carried through the still air, along with occasional pops that marked exploding sap pockets in heated trunks. I could not see flames yet, but I could feel the heat in the air when the wind shifted. When I reached the top of the slope that led down toward the river, I paused again to study the terrain. The path to the water crossed a fallen log that had once been part of a marker route for hikers. It bridged a small gully where rainwater collected in wet months. Now, the gully held a few inches of murky water and debris. The log itself weaved slightly as it spanned the gap. It had been stable enough in the past, but with smoke making my eyes sting and a pack on my back, it looked less welcoming. There were also infected nearby. I saw at least 4 in the open patches beyond the log. They stood facing random directions, occasionally taking a slow step or turning. Any noise on that log would carry. I decided to take it slowly. I slung the shotgun across my chest on the harness, freeing my hands for balance. I stepped onto the log near its thickest end, testing for movement. It held, though it flexed more than I liked. One step, then another. I placed my boots along the top, careful not to scuff the bark. Halfway across, a chunk of rotten outer bark broke under my heel. It dropped into the gully with a faint splash that sounded much louder in my head than it probably was. Still, all 4 infected in the open field turned in my direction almost immediately, heads lifting like they had heard a clear shout. They did not move right away. They stood and oriented themselves toward the source of the sound. Then, slowly, they began to walk. I did not run. Running on a flexible log with a pack and no handholds would result in a fall almost for sure. Instead, I shortened my steps and sped them up, keeping my center of gravity low. The log dipped slightly as I approached the far side. When my boot hit solid ground, I felt a surge of relief. That was when the loose gravel betrayed me. The soil near the landing was thin and sat over a layer of small stones. My weighted boot shifted them, and they rolled, producing a sliding, grinding sound that echoed down the slope. The infected below accelerated, their steps still uncoordinated but more frequent. 2 more figures emerged from a stand of shrubs, responding to the noise. I no longer had the luxury of stealth. I pulled the shotgun forward and moved down the slope in a controlled slide, keeping my weight forward, letting gravity help but not throw me. Branches whipped past, rocks slid underfoot. I stumbled once and caught myself with my free hand. By the time I reached the flatter ground near the riverbank, at least a half-dozen infected were coming down the slope behind me. One slipped and rolled, limbs flailing, but then began to rise again. Another walked straight into a tree and bounced off, then resumed moving toward me. The river was less than 50 yards away, visible through the smoke and branches as a band of moving water. I could hear its current, stronger than usual. If I could reach it and launch the raft before the infected reached the bank, I would be in relatively safe territory. My lungs burned in the smoky air as I pushed through the last stretch of undergrowth to the water's edge. The bank here was a sloped gravel bar, slick with moisture. I dropped the pack onto a relatively flat area, unslung the raft bag, and tore open the ceiling straps. The raft was a compact 2-person inflatable, more like a large pack raft than a full boat. It was made of coated fabric with welded seams. I unfolded it quickly, checking for any visible damage. None. Good. I dug out the compact hand pump from the bag and jammed the hose into the main valve. Each pump stroke seemed to take too long. The raft slowly began to take shape, rising from a shapeless pile into a recognizable hull. I forced myself into a rhythm. Pump, breathe, glance at the slope behind me, pump again. The infected were closer now, spreading out as they reached the flatter ground, their movements still not coordinated but increasingly focused in my direction. The smoke seemed to bother them less than it did me. Their eyes did not water. Their breathing, from the sounds that reached me, remained steady and heavy. The raft firmed under my hands. It did not need to be perfect, only buoyant enough to carry me in the pack without folding. I capped the valve, grabbed the bow handle, and dragged it toward the water, grunting as the wet gravel resisted. I tossed the pack and shotgun into the raft, then shoved it the rest of the way until it floated. The current caught the stern and began to pull it at an angle. I put one foot in, then the other, using the paddle I had strapped to the side to push off from the bank. As the raft moved away, I risked one last look back. A cluster of infected stood at the edge of the water, not quite reaching it. They did not jump in. They paced along the bank, arms lifting slightly, hands stretching out as if they wanted to grab hold of something that was no longer within reach. One of them stepped into the shallow water, slipped, and fell. It lay there for a moment, then began to crawl. I turned away and focused on the river. The current was stronger than I had expected. Smoke and ash had settled on the surface, mixing with foam and floating debris. The water itself was cold, pulling heat from the air around my legs where they pressed into the raft bottom. I guided the raft toward the deeper channel, where rocks were less likely to tear the hull. The creek had merged with other runoff to form a corridor that could carry me a long way if I stayed alive long enough to ride it. As the forest slipped past on either side, I looked back in the direction of the treehouse. I could not see it now. The smoke was too thick and the trees too dense. Somewhere behind me, the elevated platform I had built board by board stood above the slow gathering of the dead and the approaching fire. It might burn. It might survive as an empty shell for years. Either way, it would no longer be mine. The raft drifted under leaning branches and past gravel bars. Occasionally, I had to use the paddle to push away from a snag or rock. Once, we scraped over a shallow section, the bottom grating against stone, and I held my breath until we slid back into deeper water. I checked the floor for any sign of leakage. None appeared. Hours passed. The light changed gradually, filtered through smoke and clouds. My throat burned from the air, and I sipped water whenever the raft entered a calm stretch. The shotgun lay within arm's reach, safety on, muzzle pointed away. The revolver rested in a holster at my hip, its presence a small reassurance. Here and there, I saw movement along the banks. Sometimes it was animals, deer, or small groups of elk racing away from the direction of the fire. Sometimes it was human shapes moving with that slow, wrong gait. Infected had reached the river in several places. They walked along the banks, occasionally stepping into the shallows, then pulling back. At one point, I floated past a low spot where the bank had eroded, creating a small sandy area. There, I saw something different. A body lay face down, half in the water, clothes soaked. It did not move. Standing a few feet away, an infected man watched it. He did not approach, did not bend, did not feed or interact. He just stood and watched the body, as if waiting for it to move. When it did not, he eventually turned and walked away. The behavior raised questions I could not answer. Late in the day, I saw the first sign of human structure since leaving the treehouse. On the right bank, partially hidden by alders, stood a small cabin. It was the sort of place used by hunters or fishers, simple and functional. It had a metal roof, a small porch, and a short dock jutting into a calm bend of the river. The dock held no boats. The cabin's door was slightly open. No smoke rose from the chimney. I weighed the risks quickly. The cabin might contain supplies. It might also contain infected. Sheltering there overnight might give me a more stable base to plan from, or it might trap me if things went wrong. I decided to approach carefully, but not land unless I had to. As the current carried me past, I steered the raft toward the center, keeping my distance while my eyes scanned every visible surface. The porch held a couple of plastic chairs, one tipped over. A fishing net leaned against the wall. A pair of boots lay on their sides near the door. I saw no faces in the windows, no movement inside. Then, from behind the cabin, someone stepped into view. For a moment, I thought they were another infected. Their clothes were dirty. Their movements were slow. They held something in one hand that dragged along the ground. But then, they looked directly at me, raising a hand not in a lunge, but in an awkward, deliberate wave. They shouted something. The words were faint over the water, but carried enough to make out. "Hey, boat!" The gesture had coordination. The voice had tone and inflection. Whoever they were still human. The river did not care. It continued to carry me past. I made a split-second decision and dug the paddle into the water, fighting the current. The raft slowed. I aimed for an eddy near the dock, where water curved back on itself. The effort burned my arms and shoulders. For a while, it felt like I was not making any progress at all. Then the bow finally pointed toward the dock, and the lateral motion increased. I let the backflow pull me in, guiding the raft until I could grab a post with one hand. The person on shore moved closer. They were a woman, mid-30s maybe, with short hair tied back with a band. Her face was streaked with soot and sweat. She held a long wooden pole, not a weapon exactly, more like a tool. Her other hand braced on the dock rail. "Are you bitten?" she called, voice sharp and direct. "No," I answered, catching my breath. "You?" "No, get up here before company shows up." I tied off the raft with a quick clove hitch around the post, slung the pack, and grabbed the shotgun. I climbed onto the dock, legs shaky from hours in the raft, and stepped up onto the wooden planks. They creaked under my weight. I glanced around instinctively, looking for any sign of infected along the bank. "My name is Ethan," I said. Habit still had a place, even at the end of the world. "Lena," she replied, "you look like you know what you're doing with that pack, inside. We need to talk fast." The interior of the cabin was one large room with a small kitchenette, table, 2 bunk beds, and shelves along one wall. The air inside was cooler and less smoky. The window glass was smeared but intact. There were no bodies, no signs of overt struggle, just the scattered mess of someone living rough in a place meant for short trips. "Door stays locked unless we're both awake," Lena said, closing it behind us and sliding a bar into place. "I saw your raft and figured you were either trouble or help. If you were trouble, you would have tried to land without talking. Or been one of them," I said. "Yeah, them." We stood in awkward silence for a moment, studying each other. Her clothes were layered, practical. A long-sleeve shirt, jacket, pants with reinforced knees, worn boots. She had a belt knife and a small hunting rifle leaning against the wall near the door. Her eyes were red from smoke but clear. "Where did you come from?" she asked. "Treehouse in the forest. Old Ranger Assistant Project. North here by a few miles. Fires pushing through that area. The infected are thick on the ground under the canopy. I rode the river down to get out of the way." She raised her eyebrows slightly. "Treehouse. That is not a bad idea up there." "It was," I said, "until the fire, and until I started seeing them adapt." "Adapt how?" I told her about the sentinel, the woman who moved with more focus than the others, and seemed to study the trees rather than just wander. I described the way she repeatedly circled the trunks, dragging her hand along the bark, and how she returned night after night. Lena listened without interrupting, her expression tightening as I went on. "I've seen one like that too," she said, "on the road above here. He does not just walk, he watches, he tracks noise. The others bump into things and move on. This one actually checks places, shelves, car trunks, doors. Not always in the right way, but there is intention." That confirmed what I had feared. Whatever process was animating the dead was not static. Some of them were changing further. "What about you?" I asked. "How long have you been here?" "Since the second day after the first alerts," she said. "I was in town when things went bad. I know the family that owns this cabin. They were not here." I think they tried to get on one of the boats. I saw crowds at the harbour before I left. I took a truck on a logging road. Ended up walking the last few miles when the road got blocked. Infected were already in the streets by then. Any contact from boats? Radio chatter the first day. A few fishing vessels trying to coordinate. Then a lot of screaming. Then nothing. I have a small marine radio. I can sometimes hear long-range signals, but nothing local and stable anymore. We sat at the small table, spreading my map out between us. I marked the approximate position of the treehouse and the stretch of river I had followed. She pointed to the town's location on the coast and the roads leading out of it. There is an old logging camp inland that might still have supplies, she said, and a bigger river that connects to this one downstream. If we can get there, we might find a way toward a bigger settlement, or at least better ground. Or we can stay here until the fire reaches this area, I said. The fire is not headed straight for us from what I can tell, she said. Wind direction is in our favour for now, but for now does not mean much anymore. We talked until the light faded. We took turns on a small rooftop hatch later, looking for visible flames in the distance. The smoke layer made it hard to tell, but the glow seemed further away here than it had been at the treehouse. That night, lying on one of the cabin bunks with my shotgun within reach and a solid roof overhead, the last week washed over me in a way it had not been able to in the treehouse. There had been no time to process anything there. Every minute was about small tasks and immediate threats. Now, even with the world still burning outside, there was a moment to breathe. I thought about the quiet in the ranger channels, the transmission that had cut off mid-sentence, the familiar faces turned into silent walkers, the sentinel under my trees, and the fire advancing through the forest. The Canopy Redoubt had kept me alive through the first shock. It had proven that elevation, planning, and quiet systems could work against a threat that moved on the ground and did not climb well. But it also showed the limits of any single static position. Now the story had moved downstream into a new phase with real locations still shaping it. The Tongass behind us, the coastal town with its silent harbour ahead, the logging roads and inland camps marked on the map, and the unknown state of larger cities beyond that. My name was Ethan Cole. I had built a treehouse fortress to stay out of reach. It had done its job. The question that remained was whether I could carry that same mindset, planning, elevation, quiet power, careful movement into a world that no longer had any safe ground at all. The answer would come in the days ahead, as Lena and I left the cabin at first light, returned to the raft, and pushed back into the river, following the current toward whatever waited beyond the smoke. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.